Hi, my name is Mayada Christensen, and I'm working right now with Grow a Generation, and I've spent some time brushing up on my biology and also reading some recent research on eosinophilic esophagitis. And so I compiled a presentation and I made this screencast to show some of the things that I've been able to figure out. The three things I'm going to cover are some major players and what they're supposed to do in the body when it comes to having EoE, what actually happens when a person has EoE, and this is from a molecular level, not necessarily in terms of the symptoms, and why those things are happening. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about has come from two main studies that I have linked is in here. And in this presentation, at the very end, I've also included a link of lots of source information so that you can go back and learn more if you'd like to. And this whole presentation, so the video and the slideshow, are going to be in the research folder for the Quest for EoE project group for PA Distance. All right, so let's start with major players. The first one is the cells that line the esophagus. And so they are epithelial cells, which is similar to the cells that make up your skin and the lining of most of your organs. And they're generally flat and kind of cube shaped, and they are many layers. So you think of like a brick wall, right? Its main job is protection. So that's why the cells are close together, and that's why there's so many layers, so that things like bacteria and germs can't get through those layers. So your skin, for example, is epithelial tissue, and this is why I'm a mom of two little girls, and this is why I can change a diaper and get some poop on my hands but not get sick, because my skin doesn't let any bacteria or other pathogens through into my blood. So I just wash my hands and I'm good to go. The next major player are dendritic cells. And so here are two pictures. This one actually is an artistic rendering of a dendritic cell, and then on this side is an actual photo of a dendritic cell. And so these cells live mainly in tissues that come in contact with items from the outside world. So in the skin, in the lining of your organs. And their job is to connect an antigen to T cells or B cells. So that really means, think of it like the person who calls 911. So they see an emergency and they call 911 because they see it happening. And that's kind of what a dendritic cell does. They see an antigen or a pathogen, so that could be bacteria, an allergen, a parasite, any of those things. And they basically call your T cells to come in and fight against it. The next major player then are those T cells. And so this is an image of a T cell using an electron microscope. And so think of the T cell then as the person that actually received the 911 call. So that person would then determine who else to call. Is it a police emergency? Is it a fire? Is it an ambulance that's needed? So T cells, depending on the kind of call they get from the dendritic cell, and calls really come from they're called cytokines. They are just proteins that are messengers. So depending on the messenger they get, they can form into whatever kind of T cell that is necessary. And then that T cell can put out more messages to call the right kinds of cells to the situation. So that might be cells that are specific to kill bacteria, or cells specific for parasites, or cells specific for any other kind of thing, I guess, that could happen in your body. So on the picture, all these little things you see sticking out are little receptor sites, where different um, signals can bind to it. A signal protein, sorry, can bind to it. All right, next player is now the eosinophil, and so there are lots of layers to your immune systems. Isn't the only thing that happens, but in EoE, the next one that's really important really are eosinophils, and so that is a very specific type of white blood cell. It's made in the bone marrow, and it travels to specific tissues. So typically that means the brain, the gastrointestinal tract, like your guts, ovaries, uterus, spleen, and lymph nodes. And so they come when they're called. So helper T cells release a signal protein, like we just talked about, and attract them. And they come. And so their main function is to destroy parasites. And so this picture actually is an artist, a 3D rendering of an eosinophil. But it's really cool because these little pink dots in here are granules. And so how an eosinophil works is each of these little granules is kind of like a little grenade. And so what happens is when the eosinophil comes on site to do whatever it has to do, it releases those little grenades out. And then they kind of explode like poison bombs, kind of, that either destroy cells, or in the case of it being a parasite, what they're really designed to do is to also help your body to flush that out. So that those little poison granules that pop in your gut, for example, if you um, had bad water that had a parasite in it, that would possibly cause you to have stomach pain, diarrhea, things like that, and that's your body's way of pushing that parasite out of your body because it's not supposed to be there. So it's like, get out, man, get out. So that's kind of what eosinophils do, which is a really cool function. So when a person has eosinophilic esophagitis, three things happen at a cellular level that don't usually happen. The first thing is there's a gene in the cells of the esophagus, so in those epithelial cells, and they're expressing too much of a protein called TSLP, and that is the signal protein that calls to the T cells to call in eosinophils to come to the esophagus. So that's a big reason why they're even in the esophagus in the first place when they don't usually go there. It's because the extra TSLP protein is calling it, basically calling the eosinophils. Second thing is those epithelial cells in the lining of the esophagus have gaps in them, and they're disorganized. So they're not in nice, neat rows anymore, and they are leaky and let more things come through. And so what happens is they allow more things that you're eating to come in contact with dendritic cells. So those dendritic cells then can ring the alarm to say, hey, these things are intruders, and set off your body's immune alarm on one hand, and on the other hand, it's also letting in those eosinophils who don't normally go there. But because there's leaks and gaps, there's now room for the eosinophils to come through and kind of weave their way in between the cells of the esophagus. So then when they're there, what happens is there's a gene in the eosinophil itself that expresses a protein called UPA that activates the eosinophil. So that's kind of like pulling the pin out of the grenade, right? So you've got you've got a leaky epithelial lining, a leaky wall of your esophagus. Eosinophils are getting called in with the extra signal protein. Your dendrites are really noticing more things than they would normally notice because they can. And then once the eosinophils are there, they can release their little grenades, and this UPA protein actually is the thing that pulls the pin out of the grenade, let's say, and really like releases the poison. And so that's what causes all that irritation in the esophagus are those eosinophils who kind of release their little grenades. So that's what happens when you have EoE. Very uncomfortable, but at a cellular level, that's really what's going on. And there's been a lot of research that it has been done, and a lot that is still happening to figure out why that happens, because figuring out why really is then how scientists can figure out a cure.